Very glad to welcome all of you on behalf of the 6 component offices, history offices in the Department of Defense to the inaugural event in our speaker series, which we hope will become bigger and better as time goes along. We're actually streaming this out on video today, so they asked me to remind everybody to take off your badges so they won't be seen. And just a couple of introductory remarks about our speaker. He actually got his bachelor's degree at George Mason University, so he's a local guy. He got his PhD in 1999, taught 3 years at West Point, and since 2004 has been out at the Army's Command and General Staff College as a professor of military history there. A very prolific author on the Civil War, very well recognized and well regarded, and we're very pleased to have him here today. And without further ado, we'll let him get to talk about the subject you want to hear about.
Thank you, John. Okay, first step is making sure everybody can hear me. All right, it's great to be here, especially to be the inaugural speaker, and I'm sure what's going to be a great series. I've looked at some of the people you have coming in here in the next few iterations, and it's just a great pleasure to be here. It's good to see some of my former students from Fort Leavenworth here. I see 2 of them here in the audience. I'm not sure that the fact that it's just 2 is a good sign or not, but it is good to see them. It's good to be here. Good to give this inaugural lecture, and I figured start out by talking a little bit about history and the value and interest of history, because that's what we're all about, right? That's at least what I'm about. That's my job. So quotes, when asked, what would he advise someone who wants to follow in his footsteps, not necessarily in being defeated ultimately by Wellington, but all the good stuff he does before that. Napoleon says, if I could give advice to people who are interested in what I've done and give them guidance, the one thing I would tell them to do is to read history. As he says, read and meditate on history. It's the only real philosophy. And here you have a great painting of Napoleon, 1798, when he's in Egypt visiting the Sphinx, getting in touch with history. And from there, well, we all know Napoleon has a very, very good run. Not a permanently good run, but it's good for a while, right? And of course, since then, many, many officers have testified to the value of history in guiding and making them successful and effective. Harry Truman wrote in his memoirs that history was not just a romantic adventure to him. It was practical instruction, and it guided him, and nobody ever loses by reading history. George Patton once said, put it bluntly, to be a successful soldier, you must know history. It is the foundation of military knowledge, of doctrine, of theory. And of course, recently, someone who's of some importance to the military profession today, has offered his own words on history. General Dempsey, to understand the profession, you must understand its history. To be able to articulate, provide strategic advice, leaders must know their history. And finally, Paul Van Ripper, Lieutenant General in the Marine Corps. Didn't want to just stick with Army stuff. This is where the jointness takes place, right? So I wanted to bring in another service here. Here is General Ripper. Great quote. A properly schooled soldier never arrives on a battlefield for the first time if he has studied history and studied the past. Because even though history, it's said sometimes that inaccurate history repeats itself, it doesn't, but there are echoes, there are parallels that can inform your thinking about situations. And no officer, says Ripper, should ever go on a battlefield for the first time. Even if it's his first time there physically. If you studied history, he will equip himself with the mental qualities necessary to be effective when he arrives on that battlefield. And I'll be talking today a bit about the war in Missouri in 1861. A little bit more study of that would have made some of the more recent battlefields, I think, a little less unfamiliar when the United States military arrived on them. But here we go. The war opens April 1861 with the Battle of Fort Sumter. In this situation, as many of you have studied your history, the first battle of the Civil War, the ironic first battle of the Civil War, in which nobody is wounded or injured except for the 2 guys at the end when they misload the cannon when they're trying to fire the salute to the United States flag at the end. This is the beginning of formerly the Civil War. But the Civil War, I'm not as enthralled with the concept of the Civil War It starts in 1861, ends in April 1865. There's a very, very neat study of the Civil War in and of those 4 years. Because the Civil War, the way I think of it, is simply the most intense phase of the longer sectional conflict that begins from almost the founding of the Republic, the tensions between southern and northern states, and echoes of which still can inform some of our modern politics, this conflict between blue states, red states, and of course, the Civil War, the fighting between North and South does not end in April 1865. You also have the phase of Reconstruction, and you continue to have these conflicts between the sections continuing on deep into the 20th century. And of course, in the 1960s, we have the Civil Rights Movement, which some have called the Second Reconstruction. And some have noted the parallels. You know, in the 1860s, a Republican president sent military forces into the South in Arkansas, and in the 1860s, it was a Republican president sending troops into the South as well. But still, for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about today, if I'm going to do the whole sectional conflict today, well, I'm not going to do. I'm going to focus on the first few months, and here is as good a point to start. April 1861, we have the Battle of Fort Sumter. Tension between Abraham Lincoln's elected in November. You have several months of tension. Reconstruction actually begins in 1860 when South Carolina secedes, because what Reconstruction and the war are is continuing effort to try to find the mix of carrots and sticks that will bring southern states back into their quote-unquote proper relationship to the Union. And what Fort Sumter resolves is that there is going to be a war to do this, that political compromise and efforts to try to settle it peacefully are not going to resolve the sectional conflict. And so on the 15th of April, 1861, Abraham Lincoln issues his call for troops right after Fort Sumter. And in doing so, he defines the problem here. Traditionally, the Civil War itself, the focus is on the battles, right? The battles, the campaigns, the military leaders, the conventional contest, you know, how they maneuvered for important parts of terrain, how they maneuvered to the battlefield. And I'll talk about that with First Manassas. Okay? But the way the war is defined by Lincoln here is almost the term police action was used during the Korean War. And that also ultimately is, in some sense, that's how Lincoln is defining the problem. The problem is not secession, because according to Lincoln, secession cannot take place. It is unconstitutional. What has simply happened, and is in southern states, there have been combinations too powerful to be suppressed in the course of judicial proceedings. Yeah, he's a lawyer, right? That kind of lawyer talk. And I'm calling out 75,000 troops to suppress combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed. Okay? So he's trying to find the problem, not as a war between two independent states, because from Lincoln's perspective, secession's illegitimate, and what he calls the so-called Confederacy does not really exist. It's a legal fiction. But he's got to figure out what he's going to do, and so looks for guidance. How do we deal with military problems? Of course, in the early 19th century, a guy by the name of Baron Antoine Jomini wrote down, I know some of you at CGSC are saying, my God, we're going to go back through Jomini and Clausewitz again. Well, you know, you do go with what you know, okay? Making strategy. How do we make our plans? How do we approach military problems? And Jomini lays out a process for doing that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps. Actually, 8 steps, but you know, I'm a history major, not a math major, okay? And again, first step is agree with your head of state on the character of the war you're involved in. What is this? Is this an interstate conflict? Is it a rebellion? Is it enforcing the law? What is it? Okay? And so Jomini provides us a way of framing the way we think about conflict. Of course, the way the character of the war is defined by the two presidents, to an extent, there's a certain agreement. This is a war, a people's contest, hence the title of the lecture today. Lincoln says this is a people's contest. Governments rest on the consent of the governed. Everybody agrees this in America in the mid-19th century. It's the war language of the Declaration of Independence. Government legitimacy rests on the consent of the governed. The Northern war effort, the war for the Union, has legitimacy because it rests on the consent of the governed. Jefferson Davis uses roughly the same language, borrows language from the Declaration of Independence, consent of the governed, all we ask is you let alone. Of course, the question is, well, consent of the governed. Who are the governed, and what comprises consent? Do you need active consent, passive consent? How do military forces fit into the equation of gaining consent? Because sometimes when you use military force, it can contradict, it can hurt your efforts to gain consent of the people. Sometimes you don't use enough military force. That also undermines your ability to gain consent of the governed. So it's a very complicated problem as Lincoln and Davis are defining it. In a few places, this can be more confusing than in Missouri. And again, by consent of the governed, what they're talking about here, John Shai, who is a historian who's written about the American Revolution, said the way to think about these conflicts is to think about the triangularity of the struggle. The Federal Army, the Confederate Army, people who support the Confederate Army, people who support the Union Army, they're clearly, you know where their consent is, you know where their perspective is. But oftentimes in these conflicts, these wars of opinion, you've got a great middle apathetic mass that is neither passionate about either side. And the question is, how can we use military force in the process of the northern armies engaging the southern armies? How do we win back consent of one faction of the population without compromising our ability to maintain support from another faction? And what about that great unaligned? What do we want? What are the ways and means to get it? Now, this can be a complicated problem, can it not? I mean, if you're in a situation, here we go. You've all seen this slide. This is a famous slide, isn't it? I teach for the Army, so PowerPoint, I got to get a PowerPoint slide in here like this, right? You look at a map, and this has received a lot of attention a while back, for showing, how PowerPoint was out of control and it's supposed to clarify and make things clear, and it can do just the opposite. But sometimes the problem isn't clear, okay? Sometimes the problem isn't clear. And if you could have, in the Civil War, and again, on the surface, conventional war, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, conventional conflict, but in many ways, you could draw a slide like this for the American Civil War. You've got the issue of coalition capacity and priorities. The Union war effort, okay? Coalition, the Union war. Keep in mind, the Union war effort is a cooperative partnership between the states and the federal government. The military forces are raised by the states, and governors expect to have a say in how their forces are going to be used and who's going to command them and things like that. So there is an element of coalition warfare, your capacities, your ability to work together, and sometimes the governor of Illinois has different priorities or perspectives on priorities from the governor of New York. One looks at the Mississippi River as more important, another looks at Virginia as more important. So you've got this coalition warfare dynamic in the Civil War. Domestic support. It's a people's contest. It's not just a war for the hearts and minds of the South, but the people of the North have got to have the will to persist in this conflict. And they get the opportunity to express their sentiments in elections. Tribal governance. The South is a very, very localistic society. Okay? Local elites are local elites. Effectiveness of governance, winning sympathy, getting certain sections of the South, of Southern, for example, the eastern sections of Tennessee, the quote-unquote tribal authorities are loyal to the Union. In eastern Tennessee, the local leaders are hostile to the Union. You've got to figure out ways to work with those kinds of people. Population conditions and beliefs, infrastructure, services, and the economy. You get into the South, thing you want to do is get the economy going again, because the Southern economy is not working. You're going to have a hard time convincing the people there to return to the Union. Insurgents, outside support. Will Britain support the Confederacy? Will France support the Confederacy? Mexico? These dynamics are at work here. Narcotics? Well, maybe not so much narcotics, but if you think as cotton and having the same analogous relationship in terms of it is such a big dominant part of the economy, there are analogies, and granted, these analogies are imperfect, but just to underscore the fact that the Civil War is a very, very complicated subject. And a few places illustrate that better than the situation in Missouri, the part of the country where I come to you from. The situation in Missouri. The consent of the governed, the population. How do we win hearts and minds there? Where are their hearts and minds? Who supports us? Who's against us? Well, in November 1860, very conveniently, the people went to the polls and roughly laid out their political sympathies. People who are sympathetic, going to be very sympathetic to the Union cause, well, you can figure out that's 10.28% of the population. Okay? People who are not going to be very friendly to the Union cause and are going to support more states' rights approach, well, you can estimate 18.9%. They supported John C. Breckinridge. The other two candidates, Stephen Douglas and John Bell, presented more of a compromise, reconciliation, let's calm things down perspective. And 70% of the population voted for them, which tells you, what do the people of Missouri want? Well, we know what 10%, 18%, 30%, and how do you come up with a single policy that can satisfy a critical mass of this population? And also keep in mind, that 70%, what do they want? Probably just to be left alone, okay? They just want to be left alone. You remember the idea of John Adams' quote on the American Revolution? It was 1/3 supported the rebellion, 1/3 supported the crown, 1/3 was neutral. And 1/3 just was, would put up a finger, which way is it going this way? Which way is it? And the question of, how do you deal with the apathetic people? Can you just leave them alone? Do you say to them, hey, you can stay out of this, when the two things you expect people to provide in the 19th century are pay your taxes and provide some kind of military service? Okay, you go to the apathetic, and they say, we're apathetic, we're not going to pay any taxes. That's pretty sweet for them, right? They don't got to pay taxes to either the Confederates or the Federals, right?